is our webinar about the Willamette Basin and the series of dams that are causing havoc on some imperiled fish species within the Willamette Basin, the salmon and steelhead species that Lizzy and Laurie are going to tell you more about. My name is Anna Dimitriades. I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach for Advocates for the West. And our panelists today are Lizzy Potter, staff attorney in our Portland, Oregon office, and Laurie Rule, our senior attorney in the Portland, Oregon office. So I am going to hand it over to you all to take it from here. And so that our attendees know, I'm going to sign off, so you won't see me anymore. You'll just see our presenters. And if you have questions throughout the presentation, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be monitoring those questions. And then when we're done with the presentation, I will field those questions to our attorneys. So there you have it. I'm going to sign off and hand it off to you guys.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to get us started and I'm going to share our PowerPoint presentation so you don't have to just listen to us blab on about one of our favorite cases. So I know that we have quite a mix of supporters on this social distancing hour. I see several folks from Oregon and several from other states. And so we want to start out by, especially for those out-of-state folks, talking to you about why the Willamette River is so important. You know, there are obviously a lot of rivers across the West, but we talk about this one a lot at Advocates for the West, and it's for a good reason. So the Willamette River is a very special river in Oregon. It actually holds about 70% of the entire state's population within the broader river valley. And so if you can look at the map and see my handy dandy laser pointer that I figured out how to use. So we have Portland here. And for those of you who aren't familiar, up in the upper right-hand corner, you can kind of get a perspective of how big this valley is compared to the rest of the state. And so the light gray area is the Willamette Valley that we're going to be talking about throughout this presentation. And so it's a pretty big chunk of the state, and it in fact holds most of its population. All of the big cities, Portland, Eugene, and Salem, are capital. And so it flows through Oregon City, and then we're going to talk about Willamette Falls, which is a pretty important piece of the fish populations that we're focused on today. And it winds down through Salem and up and into these substantial tributaries that are very important in our case. So the North Sanium and the South Sanium, going down into the McKenzie River and the Middle Fork Willamette down here, if you can see my laser pointer still. And on these maps, these big black dots are the federal dams that we're going to be referring to throughout our presentation. And so keep those in mind, that this is the valley. These big black pieces over here on the right are some of the federal dams that are at issue in our lawsuit. And a few other things to note on this map before we move on. You know, here in the upper reaches, the headwaters of many of these tributaries, this dark green area is national forest land that's in pretty incredible condition. It's pretty beautiful, pretty pristine, really great. You know, there's some private timberlands there and some timber areas, but for the most part, it's pretty great habitat up in the upper stretches of these rivers. And then over here on the left, these orange rivers, these are some of the Coast Range tributaries of the Willamette River that are not as, they're not really at issue in our lawsuit. So a little, if you're like me, really like maps, hopefully this will give you a little bit of perspective about this important watershed that we're going to be talking about today. So yes, it flows up here in the Cascades, down through Portland, and then out to the Columbia River. It's one of the biggest tributaries of the Columbia River. So these dams, what are they? Why are they important? They're all Army Corps of Engineer dams. They were built back in the 50s and 60s for the most part. There are a total of 13 of these federal dams, but some of them are particularly problematic because they're what we refer to as high head dams. And so that means that they're several hundred feet tall, among the tallest that are out there in our country, some of them. And what's unique about these dam systems compared to some of the other ones that you may hear about, like the Lower Snake dams, these dams were built primarily for flood control. And so that's important because unlike some of the dams that have reached the end of their lifespans or are not super important for different purposes, the truth is that a lot of these dams are flood control dams that prevent Eugene, Portland, and some of the other downriver valleys from flooding during big rainstorms. But flood control isn't the only purpose of these dams. Some of them have turbines and produce a small amount of power. It's pretty incredible, actually, how insufficient or how not important this power is. It is less than 4% of the regional power production, and so it's a very small slice, very incidental purpose to some of these bigger Willamette Valley project purposes. And the other thing that's really unique about the power production is on some of the tributaries. So the North Sanium, the South Sanium, and the Middle Fork, three of the key rivers that we're going to be talking about today in the system, there are sets of dams. And so if you're familiar, those Oregonians on the webinar today with the Detroit and Big Cliff dams on the North Sanium, Detroit is upstream and it's the power dam, it's a power peaking dam, and right down below there's a second dam that regulates the water flows from the turbines. And so what does this mean? It means that the power peaking dams don't run all the time. The turbines just sort of turn on when there's a peak need for power and turn off at other times. And so because the turbines aren't running consistently, water isn't flowing steadily through these dams. And so it creates huge fluctuations in the flows below the dams that then the downstream re-regulating dam re-regulates those flows to smooth it out for the downstream areas. And so in that stretch of river, though, between the power peaking dam and the re-regulating dam, you can just imagine what happens when you have sort of more intense fluctuations in river levels. And so it's kind of a little bit of a wonky topic, but something that, again, makes these power producing dams fairly unique from other systems that some of you might be familiar with. Another one of the purposes that is supported by these dams is recreation. Typically that requires the Army Corps to keep the reservoirs behind the dams very high in both the spring and the summer to keep the boaters happy. And so that is an important theme to note in some of the work that we're going to be talking about, that conflict with high reservoirs and recreation. There are also some irrigation benefits. Irrigation is not a huge driver of the operation of these dams, although if you've been following some of our work, you might have heard about this controversial reallocation process of all the water stored in this system that could potentially make irrigation a more controversial and substantial use of these dams. It's also unique in that there's really no navigation because of Willamette Falls, which is the second largest waterfall in the United States by volume. And so it's a very big waterfall system and is very important when we talk about the salmonids that use the upper Willamette River watershed. So spring Chinook and winter steelhead are the only two salmonids that have evolved to be able to migrate over that massive waterfall in Oregon City. It's pretty fantastic. If you haven't had a chance to go visit Willamette Falls and do a paddle there, it's pretty awesome. You can take canoes and kayaks, or I guess motorboats too, pretty close to the falls, and it's a pretty impressive sight. And so these two types of salmonids that have evolved to make it up and over the falls, they have very unique genetics and they're very special. But it's also pretty rare and important that there are only two of them, two of these native fish species. And historically there were, They estimate, who knows for sure, but they estimate that there were more than 300,000 of the spring Chinook and 200,000 of the winter steelhead in the upper river and some of those tributaries that we talked about. But like a lot of salmonids in the Pacific Northwest, the populations have plummeted from historic levels. More than 90% from those levels. And so in the late 1990s, the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS, listed them as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. What's really unfortunate is how these populations have continued to decline since that listing. So in this graph here, you can see this is an estimate of the wild spring Chinook. These are counts from Willamette Falls. So the numbers start in 2002, which is shortly after the species were listed. Pretty big drop here. These ups and downs, these cyclical population cycles are pretty common, but as one of our experts in this work, Kirk Schroeder, notes, what you start seeing with these populations is those cycles start cycling lower and lower and lower. So the peaks get lower and the valleys get pretty dangerously low at times. And so you can see how much this population, this is Chinook and steelhead is sadly not much different, have really plummeted just since the species were listed under the ESA. I think a couple of pretty sad statistics. So in 2019, spring Chinook counts, the adult counts were at their lowest that the agencies have found since 2008. And then in 2017, steelhead recorded their lowest counts on record ever. And so these fish are in very bad shape. And I know anytime people talk about salmon, or steelhead, you hear people saying the populations are in very bad shape, but this is about as bad as it gets. Some of the Snake River stocks are similarly imperiled, but it is very dire what is happening to these species. And so, it's pretty sad. What's remarkable about this is what has caused this decline, what continues to cause this decline. It's pretty much one big factor. So the Willamette Valley dams are the primary cause of the population drop and the continued decline of these species. You hear a lot these days about poor ocean conditions and climate change and hatcheries, but here the data and the experts and the expert agencies as well, it's all pretty clear. It's pointing to the dams. And what's so bad about these dams? The really big problem with these dams is that they cut off a substantial portion of the spawning habitat for these fish. And so in the Middle Fork Willamette that we keep referring to, that's up to nearly 90% of that habitat. Throughout the population's range, though, it's about 70% for the spring Chinook and about 33% for steelhead. And why does this matter? Why does spawning habitat matter that much? Well, if the adults can't get up to some of that pristine habitat that I mentioned in particular at the beginning of the presentation, up there in some of that beautiful forest land, some of that really great high elevation, cold streams, they can't get back up there to complete their life cycle. They're forced to spawn unnaturally below the dams in habitat that is typically not nearly as conducive for survival and thriving. And so, that's one of the big key issues that we are trying to address with this work, is dealing with the lack of access to historical spawning habitat. So what's happening with the fish now? There is some upstream passage. So when the adults make it back to below the dams, for the ones that wouldn't naturally spawn below the dams, some of them are trucked up and above different dams in the North Sanium, a bit above Foster in the South Sanium and the Middle Fork. But for those fish experts on the line and those who aren't, that type of non-volitional passage is not super fantastic. We don't want to have human intervention sustaining these populations, but unfortunately with these high head dams, fish ladders are pretty much impossible. And so for the time being, at least until technology advances, we're pretty much stuck with some of that trap and haul for the upstream passage in certain areas. But the big issue, especially in our case, is about what happens once the fish, the adults, make it upstream or are planted upstream spawn, and then the juveniles are ready to come back down. Juvenile passage through the dams is very hazardous. So there are a couple of key factual issues here to be aware of. The reservoirs behind these dams can be massive, and they cause big problems for the fish. I think the Lookout Point Reservoir, which is in the Middle Fork, I think that reservoir is 14 miles long. Imagine if you were a tiny little fish trying to navigate through this slack water reservoir, that when it's big and wide, much wider than it would be naturally. And so the sun heats up the reservoir, and so it gets hot, and it gets, there's a lack of movement. So it's hard for the fish to navigate. They naturally have evolved to respond to flows and, moving water to get downstream when they're ready to migrate out to the ocean. But there are also these reservoirs, they create unnaturally high levels of predators that eat them, or make them expend more energy trying to get away from the predators. And there are also big problems with parasites. Copepods in particular are really interfering with, can really cause mortality and other problems for these fish. But so then if they can even survive the reservoirs and navigate all the way down to the dam face, it's not much better once they get there in most of the places. There are three typical passage methods. One is spill. If you follow the drama in the Columbia River dams, the Snake River dams, you might be familiar with the concept of spill. The spillways at the top of the dams, when the reservoirs are high, and the flows are big enough, they can literally spill the water down through the spillways instead of through the turbines. And that's typically a safer passage method, but for most fish, or for most of the year, it's not always available, because especially with these Willamette dams, the reservoirs need to be pretty high for spill to be available. And so most of the time the fish are stuck trying to find other outlets, which in most dams are limited to turbines or regulating outlets. Turbines are the power production centers of the dam, and they have, blades that move very fast and cause high levels of mortality and injury for these fish trying to, get through those areas. So that's not very great. The regulating outlets, which are just kind of holes in the dam that can be opened and water can pass. Those are a little bit better, but the problem with them is they're often much lower than the turbines. And fish are not known to sound more than about 40 or so feet, at least safely. It's very hard for them to dive down into the reservoirs and find the regulating outlet. How would they know they're there? Especially if you have these slack water reservoirs, there's not, natural movement encouraging them to find those places to safely pass. Plus, the agency's, trying to produce power when it can. And so the turbines are typically used more often than the regulating outlets. So the bottom line here is, once the fish navigate through these nasty reservoirs and get to the dam face, its survival is low. And another key issue with juvenile passage is the time of year that it can happen. Historically, one of the fish are more, juveniles typically pass, in a large fraction of them pass in the spring, when you have high spring flows, flushing flows, encourages a lot of the juveniles to get out, and that's when they often want to pass. But what's happening during the spring with how these dams are operated? If you recall, I mentioned before the importance of keeping reservoirs high for recreation purposes. Typically, the Corps in the spring starts to refill the reservoirs to meet those high levels for recreation purposes, and isn't passing a lot of those flushing spring flows and keeping the reservoirs down at levels where the fish can pass more safely. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with dams, I hope this isn't too confusing, but this is a little bit of I'm trying to set Laurie up for, some of her discussion about what we're looking for to make things better for these fish. And so hopefully that's a little bit of an introduction about how the reservoirs are maintained. Maybe one other key issue with the reservoirs to note is then what happens, high flows or high refill in the spring, keep the reservoirs high. Largely for recreation. It's also, the Corps is a number of other reasons why it keeps the reservoirs high in the spring, temperature control, things like that. And then in the summer, it still tries to keep those reservoirs about as high as it can, but as the precipitation in the Willamette Valley decreases, the reservoirs start to decrease. And then it's in the fall when the Corps is ready to evacuate the reservoirs to make room, to keep them low, to make room for spring or fall precipitation to serve flood control purposes. So I know it's a lot of detail, but it's really, some of these reservoir issues are really key to understanding both the harm to these fish, why they're almost extinct, and what we're trying to do to stop them from going extinct. Passage is by and away the biggest problem for these fish, but another big one is involves water quality and flows. So those reservoirs, the reservoir heating that I talked to you about before, what happens is when you have these big reservoirs, the temperature of the water starts to stratify, and so you get really hot water on top, colder water below. When the reservoirs are high, water is released generally from some of through the turbines and the regulating outlets down below. And so you're releasing that cold water when the reservoirs are higher. And that's typically, spring and summer when waters would generally be warmer. And so you have abnormally cold water that gets released during some seasons. And then as the reservoir lowers through the summer and the fall, that hot water starts being released through the dams. And in the fall, which is a very important time for Chinook's spawning season in particular, one of the big problems with hot water spawning eggs is early emergence, which can of the eggs and the juveniles, which can really have a negative impact on survival. And so the water temperatures are another big problem with these tributaries, the water temperatures below the dams. The other big one is flows. Unlike some of the other water systems across the West where water is a problem, it's not the quantity of water, it's sort of when the water is being released. And in particular, some of the bursts, the short-term flow issues. A really sad scenario happened in 2011 where there were really high flows that ODF&W has speculated, or not speculated, but they believe contributed to scouring of redds that displaced newly emerged fish and caused a near complete failure of that class of Chinook in the South Santiam in 2010. So just one of the sad and mind-boggling statistics about this, this situation. And so there are a lot of other situations where you have emergency maintenance, things like that cause bursts of that power peaking that I was talking about, how it can quickly, cause high flows and then pull them back. That can have some pretty negative impacts on the fish. And then total dissolved gas levels are another big problem. So I'm going to turn it over to Laurie in just a few minutes, but before she talks about the lawsuit that we've been working on, I want to tell you why we got involved in the first place. So if you recall, the species, I said they were listed towards the end of the 1990s, and consultation under the Endangered Species Act, though, was delayed for several years. The Army Corps of Engineers and the National Marine Fisheries Service couldn't get it together in complete consultation for a number of reasons that we can tell you about another time. But the important thing was it took a lawsuit to force the agencies to actually complete that consultation, which resulted in a biological opinion in 2008, where NIMS found that the dams, the Willamette Valley Project, was likely to jeopardize the species unless the Corps took a whole host of additional actions. The BIOP had important deadlines for interim and permanent passage and water quality measures. So you'll hear a lot about Laurie, about that when Laurie talks. But it's important to note the interim and permanent passage. There was a lot that the Corps needed to do in the meantime before it could figure out how it was going to ensure safe passage for the future. But so the Corps just started blowing off these deadlines pretty quickly, and for years didn't do what it was supposed to do under the BIOP. And so not many people were paying attention. We speculate why that's the case. Unlike the Columbia and the Snake River Dam systems that have received an incredible amount of attention from various stakeholders, here in the Willamette, there's a lack of commercial fisheries. There aren't nearly some of the economic interests that there are in the Columbia Basin. Who knows why, but it wasn't until we got involved and teamed up with our fantastic clients, the Northwest Environmental Defense Center, Native Fish Society, and Wild Earth Guardians. The Northwest Environmental Defense Center was one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit to force the 2008 BIOP, and I want to give credit. I think all or most of these pictures are from Native Fish Society in this slide, so thank you. I think some of you are on this webinar today, and I know that there are some representatives from Wild Earth Guardians too, so thanks for joining us. You all are fantastic advocates for these fish, and so we filed this lawsuit that Laurie's going to talk about in March of 2008. We are focusing on those key deadlines that the Corps blew off related to fish passage and water quality. And lo and behold, pretty quickly, the Corps said, "You got us." I mean, it was pretty clear that the agency had blown off these deadlines, and as a result needed to start reinitiating consultation. And so the agency did that right away. But these fish are almost gone. And so, the big problem is what's going to happen in the meantime while the agencies craft a new plan for how to save these fish. And so the Corps' failure to adopt meaningful measures in the interim is what led us to where we are today. So Laurie, do you want to?
Yeah, can you back up one slide? I'm going to talk a little bit more.
Yeah.
So I'm Laurie Rule. I'm the senior attorney in the Portland office, and Lizzy and I have been working on this case for quite a while. I think almost since she started working at Advocates, I drug her into this case. And I think how this case evolved is interesting because it's not really typical of a lot of our cases. We didn't have clients banging down our doors. This wasn't an area that we had worked on before. It wasn't species that we had worked on before. And, how it came about essentially is just because I started hearing and reading things that seemed wrong. I heard, I was reading articles in the newspaper and magazines, and I was getting comments from agency folks and other fisheries folks and fishermen about how the species were going downhill, about how the Army Corps of Engineers was not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and all these dams were causing all of these problems. And then in the beginning, I was just like, oh yeah, that's kind of, that's really kind of stinky and that's bad for the fish. But then the more I heard about it, and the more people really were complaining about the Corps' lack of action, I thought, well, is anybody looking into this? Maybe we should look into this. And so we did. We started investigating. I stuck Lizzy with the task of digging through a whole bunch of Army Corps of Engineer documents, and she dug and she dug and dug and dug, and we started realizing, yeah, there's a problem here. As she mentioned, there's a 2008 biological opinion that at that point, was probably eight or so years old. And that biological opinion included quite a few requirements that the Corps was supposed to take to help these fish. Under the ESA, if the National Marine Fisheries Service determines that an action is going to jeopardize a species, it has to come up with other measures that the action agency must take to avoid jeopardizing the species. And indeed, NMFS had these other measures, in fact, about 90 pages of measures in its 2008 biological opinion that the Corps was supposed to implement to help the fish. And a lot of these measures had deadlines. They had deadlines for both short-term measures that could happen within the next 5 years to help the fish right away. And they had deadlines for larger measures that were more structural changes to the dams that were supposed to help the fish. And the key measures, some of the ones that NIMS really focused on and made very clear that were critically important for avoiding jeopardy to the fish, were the downstream passage measures and the water quality measures. And each of these had, multiple deadlines that the Corps was supposed to meet to implement them to improve things for the fish. And they had not met by far the most of these deadlines. And so we started talking that, yeah, maybe we think there's a lawsuit here. At a minimum, they need to reinitiate consultation because they've now missed, this was probably in 2017, they had already missed several deadlines by several years, key deadlines. And so, yeah, we started talking to the folks that we knew. We started talking to NEDC because they had brought the original lawsuit to force the completion of the 2008 BIOP. And we have a good longstanding relationship with Wild Earth Guardians. And so we started chatting with them about it. And then we thought, well, heck, Native Fish Society seems like they might be concerned about this. So we started talking with them and we developed this really wonderful coalition that, all of us have been on this journey now for probably the last 3 years. And it's been a fantastic team. And we launched it, and actually we launched it with a notice letter in November 2017. And under the ESA, you basically have to notify the agency 60 days before you can sue them. And so we sent them the notice letter, and the Corps on like day 59 sent us a pretty lame response. It was literally like one paragraph that said, well, we'll think about making some changes. Thanks for letting us know. We'll get back to you at some point. And so it was clearly an inadequate response. They weren't agreeing to do anything, they were not even agreeing to reinitiate consultation. So a few months later, we filed our lawsuit in March 2018, like the slide shows. And we had 3 claims in our lawsuit. The first claim was, you guys need to reinitiate consultation with NIMS. You need to come up with a new biological opinion because you've completely blown off the 2008 biological opinion. You've missed all these deadlines. You haven't done nearly enough of the measures that were required under that biological opinion. So everything has changed from what the expectations were under that opinion. NIMS expected you to complete a lot of these measures in order to avoid jeopardy, and that the species would be on the increase, and the species would be, things would be getting better and they'd be increasing their populations, and that had not happened. So it was time to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new long-term plan. So that was claim number 1, need to reinitiate consultation. Claim number 2 was, gee, by the way, because you haven't done all of these things that you were supposed to do, you're continuing to jeopardize the continued existence of these species, which is unlawful under the Endangered Species Act. Essentially, you're just doing status quo, the same as what you were doing way back in 2008. And that's exactly what NIMS said was causing jeopardy to the fish. Not much has changed. So you're continuing to jeopardize these species. And our third claim was that you're also continuing to take these species. Under the Endangered Species Act, no person can take an endangered or threatened species. And take means harass, harm, kill, wound, basically causing harm to individual members of a species is take. And you can, NIMS authorized a certain level of take in the 2008 biological opinion, saying, okay, if you operate the dams and you complete all of these measures, there's going to be some level of mortality that's going to occur. But we think it's basically an acceptable level of mortality that won't actually jeopardize the species. Well, the Corps was blowing past most of those authorized take levels, particularly for the downstream fish passage. So the mortality from downstream fish passage was much higher than what NIMS had authorized in the biological opinion. So those were our 3 claims. And like Lizzy said, lo and behold, literally 3 weeks after we filed the complaint, the Corps reinitiated, sent us a letter saying, oh, we've reinitiated consultation. So, okay, great. So, 3 weeks into our case, we already won one of our claims. Woohoo! So we sort of declared a small victory, but then we said, well, that's great, but look how long it took you to do the first one. We know it's going to take you quite a while to do a new consultation. And so what are you going to do in the meantime? You're going to have to make some changes to improve things for the fish. We're not just going to let you keep doing what you've been doing for another 4 or 5 years while you do a new consultation. And so we went back and forth a little bit, but they were not really willing to do much of anything at all. Nothing meaningful, for sure. And so we said, okay, we're going to continue with our litigation. And so we did. And initially we filed a preliminary injunction, which means we were asking the court for immediate relief to try and help the fish before we actually fully litigated the case. And we were not successful with our preliminary injunction, but it was not a horrible loss, I would say. One of the better negative decisions I've received, because the judge was like, I don't know, probably a 26, 28 page decision. And the first 24 or so pages basically was judge saying why we're going to win on the merits of our case. Why we're probably going to win all 3 of our claims. And then he spent about 2 pages at the end saying, oh, but I find that there's not going to be irreparable harm to the species in the short time in which we would be litigating the case. And so I'm not going to issue a preliminary injunction. So we lost on the harm angle because the court basically said, look, this is, we can litigate this before there's going to be a real irreparable harm. Now we think that really the judge just at that point was, whoa, I don't want to become a dam master, just spur of the moment. So we think he just really didn't want to get into the nitty gritty at that point, which was understandable. It's a complicated thing. So we moved forward onto summary judgment and we briefed the legal claim, the same 3 legal claims. We briefed our jeopardy claim, our take claim, and our reinitiation claim, even though they had already reinitiated. I'll get to that. And we finished the briefing. We were supposed to have an oral argument and then COVID happened. And so the judge canceled the argument and said he would just rule on the briefs, which we thought, okay, hopefully he's just going to rule the same way he did before. And pretty much he did. So we got a decision in August. In fact, it was the last day of my vacation. It was right after I got out of a 7-day backpack trip from Olympic National Park. And I got a wonderful text from Lizzy saying that we had won our case, all 3 claims, which was a fantastic way to end my vacation. And indeed, when I read the decision, I was like, whoa, crap, man, this is awesome. And he tracked our reasoning all along the way. And so I'm going to read a couple passages because it's really a fantastic decision for us. So on the jeopardy claim, he ruled, he made some really interesting and important findings in the jeopardy claim. I mean, the first thing he said, which again, tracked what we were arguing, is that downstream fish passage and water quality are the 2 biggest problems for the fish. And he says, it's specifically, the biological opinion is unequivocal. The Corps needed to implement the entire reasonable and prudent alternative. So all the measures that were in there, especially the measures addressing downstream passage and water quality issues, to avoid jeopardizing the listed salmonids. So, okay, yep. So he agreed with this: fish passage, water quality, 2 of the biggest problems for the fish. He also agreed with us that the Corps didn't do what they were supposed to do with regard to downstream fish passage and water quality. He agreed that there were a number of measures in the 2008 biological opinion that required the Corps to take actions, both short-term interim actions and longer-term, more substantial actions, that there were deadlines for those actions, that those deadlines were hard deadlines, and the Corps hadn't done much of them at all. They missed most of the deadlines. He even went as far as talking about specific deadlines for specific analyses that they were supposed to do, and they missed those deadlines. And so he very clearly noted that that the Corps was not taking the key actions that they were supposed to take. The other thing he noted, which was also very important in terms of the evidence, and we were very glad that he agreed with us on that, is that the Corps' actions, the operations of those dams, were causing, or at least contributing to, the continued decline of the species. And he was very adamant about this. He noted that far short of moving towards recovery, the Corps is pushing Upper Willamette River, Chinook, and steelhead even closer to the brink of extinction. The record demonstrates that the listed salmonids are in a more precarious condition today than they were at the time NIMS issued the 2008 biological opinion. The status of both species has declined since 2008, and both species remain at high risk as they continue to experience the adverse effects caused by operation of the project. And so, yeah, Lizzy put that quote up there. He was very clear that these species are continuing to decline and the Corps is at fault. They are the ones pushing these species closer to the brink of extinction. And so he put all of that together in his conclusion, where basically he said, you know, the Corps has failed to implement key measures that were necessary to improve two of the primary impediments to these salmonids: downstream fish passage and water quality. The Corps has not taken any reasonable alternative measures that would improve things for the fish, even if they weren't necessarily in the biological opinion. The status of the species has continued to decline since the 2008 biological opinion. And the Corps' failure to implement the measures from the 2008 biological opinion is a cause of that decline. Accordingly, the Corps is violating ESA Section 7A2. Boom. That was pretty awesome. And so that was his ruling on the jeopardy claim. He also had really good language on the take claim. He held that indeed that the Corps was exceeding the limits of take authorized by NIMS in the 2008 biological opinion with regard to the downstream fish passage. You know, NIMS had set certain percentages of survival percentages for what was expected at each of those dams, and that the mortality at each of those dams was either slightly or in some cases far, far higher than what NIMS had listed in the 2008 biological opinion. And so the Corps was continuing to exceed the amount of harm that was allowed from downstream fish passage. And the other interesting thing about the take ruling is that he ruled the take was not just caused by the existence of the dams, but by the Corps' discretionary actions in operating the dams, which is important because the government was arguing, oh, it's just because the dams are there and there's nothing, you know, the Corps isn't doing anything to cause the take. And the judge said, no, that's not right. The Corps is doing things to cause the take. So he ruled for us on their take claim. And then lastly, he ruled for us on our reinitiation claim. And he held that, first of all, our claim was still a live claim, even though the agencies had reinitiated consultation already. He said, yes, but if there was an unlawful delay in the reinitiation, then there was additional harm occurring to those species during that delay. And if so, then I can order relief to alleviate some of that harm. So the claim was still a live claim. And he found that, yes, the agencies unlawfully delayed reinitiating consultation because they blew past a bunch of deadlines. They knew they missed these deadlines. They missed them by several years. They missed a number of deadlines by several years. And he said, you know, at least by 2013 or 2014, they should have reinitiated because they knew the Corps was missing a bunch of important deadlines. So we won all three of our claims. So awesome. Week later, man, we had to shift gears because moving on to the next phase. So what does that mean? We won our legal claims, great. Now we have to figure out what is the Corps going to do to remedy these legal violations. And that's where the rubber meets the road, because that's where all the technical details come into play. And it's a difficult conundrum, because these dams, like Lizzy said, are flood control dams. They are not coming out. And so now we are in the process of dealing with the remedies in the remedy phase of the case. We filed our opening brief just, what was that, like a week and a half ago. And we'll be working on this clear through till spring. We have an evidentiary hearing in early May. And so what are we asking for? Well, here's some of the things we're asking for. And it's definitely complicated. And, it's hard because we have like 4 different tributaries and we have 8 different dams. And there's 2 different species with different timing, biological timing. But some of the key things we're asking for, as Lizzy mentioned, I want to make sure, I'm doing okay on time. As Lizzy mentioned, the reservoir, the level of the reservoir is an important factor in fish migration, for downstream migration. And so the little juveniles, they enter at the head of the reservoir, and then all of a sudden their water slows down. It's like they're in a lake. And so there's no flow for them to follow. I mean, that's normally, like she said, how the fish navigate is they follow the flow of the river. And so they get to this reservoir, and now all of a sudden the flow stops, and so they don't know which way they're going. So they go back and forth and up and down, and there's predators and there's parasites, and it takes them forever to get down to the dam face, if they ever get there at all, without being eaten or just stuck in the reservoir. And so and once they get to the dam face, then it's difficult to find the outlets. If the reservoir is below the level where they can spill, they have turbines and regulating outlets. Those are the only 2 ways to get through the dam, and the turbines are not very friendly to fish. And so one of the things we're asking for is reservoir drawdowns in the fall. So that means that they draw the reservoir down lower than what they would normally do, so that it's near the level of the regulating outlet. So if they draw the reservoir down lower, first of all, hopefully it will help the fish navigate to find the dam because the reservoir is smaller. It's a smaller area, and there's going to be at least a little bit more flow. And so you get a smaller reservoir, they get to the dam face, and then the idea is that the reservoir is only about 20 to 25 feet above the regulating outlets, and the turbines are off. They had to turn the turbines off. So the idea is that the fish can find these regulating outlets. They don't get sucked into the turbines. They find the regulating outlets, and they can get through them and make their way downstream. So that's measure number 1 that we're asking for. The Corps is not a fan of the deep drawdowns that we're asking for because it would curtail power production. And they think that power production gets first priority over fish, particularly when the reservoirs are at a certain level. So we have to get through that argument with the court, and hopefully the judge will agree with us that yes, the Corps does have authority to do these drawdowns and to prioritize fish over power production. That's one of the key legal questions that we're going to be asking the court to answer in the remedy phase, which has implications well beyond just the remedy phase of this case. Another thing we're asking for is in the spring to do more spill, like Lizzy was mentioning, again, turn the turbines off and spill for about 30 days in a row is what we've proposed, because that will hopefully create, again, some water flow. And so the fish that are coming into the reservoir in the spring, even if the reservoir is at a higher level, the spill can create somewhat of a flow, at least in the area, sort of the lower reservoir that's closer to the dam. And so it creates a little bit of a attractant flow to get to the dam, and then they spill over the top of the dam. They're not going through the turbines. So that's another one. And so you can see the drawdown and the spill and turning the turbines off, all 3 of those sort of in combination are to try to help the fish get through the dam, both in the fall with the drawdowns and in the spring with the spill. And then we're also asking for a couple other measures, like using a couple of the lower outlets in the fall to help cool water temperatures, some other measures to help address the total dissolved gas issues. But if we had 3 pages of operational measures that we're seeking at these various dams to try and improve things for the fish. And frankly, most of this is just stuff that the Corps should have done 10 years ago, or maybe 8 years ago, a long time ago. I mean, this is stuff that's, it's not rocket science. It's tough, but it's stuff that's been on the mind of the agencies in the Corps for many, many years, and the Corps just dragged its feet and not done it. Even though NIMS and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife have pushed for these things for years. So the other two things I want to mention that we're asking for is a bunch of monitoring to make sure, or to find out if the measures that we're asking for are effective, or if there are adjustments to the measures. You know, they monitor the measures, they monitor their survival success after doing the measures, and perhaps they decide, oh, well, let's, you know, we need to tweak it here, tweak it there, make some adjustments. And we'll see if that's a little bit better for the fish. So monitoring is critically important to see how successful or unsuccessful these measures are. And then we've also asked for a technical team. One of the problems that we have learned throughout this litigation is that the Corps, I mean, there are plenty of biologists involved here, from NIMS, from ODF and W, and the Corps just oftentimes ignores them. I mean, they have these water teams, which are these essentially technical teams to try and, you know, solve the problem and improve things for the fish. But, you know, the NIMS and ODF and W biologists make recommendations, and the Corps just says, no, we can't do that. Either we don't have funding, we don't have authority, it's going to screw up power production or whatever. And so we're proposing a technical team that does not include the Corps, which they're not going to be happy about, but we have at least initially proposed a technical team with NIMS biologists, ODF and W biologists, and a couple of our own experts to assess what's going on and to basically tell the Corps what they need to do to help the fish. And the Corps has to follow them unless it's going to impact, you know, flood control, or there's going to be a safety issue or something like that. So we're trying to remove some of the discretion that the Corps has had in ignoring the biological needs of the fish. And I will also add that, interestingly, after we filed our opening brief, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is seeking leave to be amicus in the remedy phase of the case. And they filed a proposed amicus brief and 2 declarations from their fish biologists that completely support our remedy proposal. Not surprisingly, because they have, you know, provided us a little bit of information along the way, but they are totally behind us and providing additional support for what we're asking for from the court, which is going to be, I think, very helpful. And I think there's one more slide. What's my, long-term recovery outlook, right? So, you know, a lot of these operational measures are just short-term things. Again, the Corps and NIMS are putting together a new biological opinion, which is going to be the long-term plan. We don't know what's going to be in there. But some of the things that we think are going to be, you know, potential long-term solutions for these fish. One of them is eliminating power production. So that is, we've started down that line, not we, but, you know, BPA and Congress are actually looking into that. BPA wants to get out of the Willamette with power production because, like Lizzy said, it provides very little production and it's very expensive compared to the Columbia system. It's like 3 times as expensive and only 4% contributes 4% of the power. And so BPA is actually in favor of getting rid of power production, but they need Congress to deauthorize it. So Congress is asked the Corps to put together a report to at least look at what it would be like to deauthorize power for Cougar Dam, Detroit Dam, that's on the McKenzie River and the North Santiam River. And if they were able to do that, then they could get rid of the turbines, potentially even get rid of the re-regulating dams if there was no power production going on. And that would be a huge benefit for the fish because you could use those turbine outlets. If there's no turbines anymore, they could just be outlets and they could be additional passageways through the dams for the fish. Another thing that would be beneficial is these run-of-the-river operations where basically the reservoirs are drawn down to a low level and they're just like a river. They're not drawn down all the way to the riverbed, but essentially the inflow into the reservoir equals the outflow. And so there's going to still have to be some flood control operations, but what won't happen is the reservoirs won't go up to a really high level in the summer. They'll just be kept at a low level. And so for flood control, that's fine because they just keep them at a low level in the winter for flood control anyway. So they would just stay down there. And other than, you know, flood control operations, they would just basically allow the water to just flow right through. And that would be much better for the fish because they wouldn't get stuck in these huge, slow moving slack water reservoirs. And they'd be able to get through the dams easier because they'd be the water would be closer to the level of the regulating outlets. Another thing is retrofitting the dam outlets to make them less hazardous. Some of these outlets, even the regulating outlets, are not awesome. They cause injury to the fish. So making some changes to those various outlets, and then again, more changes to address water temperatures and total dissolved gas. Either some structural changes could be useful in some instances, additional operational changes, particularly if there's no prioritizing for power production, you could change operations in a way that would create less total dissolved gas and probably better water temperatures. So those are some of the longer term things that would be, that are being contemplated to help these fish. And conclusion, yeah, there we go. We got into this because nobody else was there doing it. And I think, our work is having a fairly significant impact. Now the Corps realizes they can't just keep doing what they're doing. They can't just get away with the status quo. And so we are making some pretty significant changes, and hopefully more significant changes will occur once we get through the remedy phase of this case.
Thank you both so much. I don't know about all of our attendees, but for me, I learned so much just in the last few years of hearing you all talk about this work and how critical it is. And it's really wonderful to have it all condensed into this presentation. You did an excellent job. It's so, it is really inspiring, the work that both of you are doing to help these fish and our clients. And I'm so glad to see so many of our clients or reps from our clients on the call today. So thank you all for joining us. It's really, really good to see your, well, not your faces, but your names on my screen. We do have just a couple of questions. So I'm gonna go to those right now. We have one from John and Paula Warren that says, does FERC have levers you can use since they generate power? Lizzy is shaking her head, and I think so.
No, these are not FERC licensed dams. These are Army Corps of Engineer dams, so they don't need FERC licenses.
Okay. And I do have one from Lynn. Hi, Lynn. Nice to see your name on my screen here. Lynn asks, what is the difference between the Corps of Engineers being authorized by Congress to provide a stated service or project purpose, such as a navigational channel for barging freight, and being mandated to provide that service? Has this distinction been litigated in the past? And I'm not sure if this will apply to the high head dams or not.
So yes, I mean, generally it's been, so generally the litigation there's been litigation over in the Columbia system related to kind of conflicts between power production and fish needs. And there's also been some litigation back in the Midwest, like over the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. Essentially, the Corps has discretion to manage its dams to meet multiple uses. All dams have multiple uses. And these dams are no different. They have multiple uses as well. And so the Corps has discretion, and they can reduce one use to prioritize another use, but they can't totally eliminate a use. So essentially what the Ninth Circuit has said with regard to the Columbia system is that, yes, power production is an authorized use, fish and wildlife is an authorized use. And because of the ESA, you have to give priority to fish, even if it reduces power production. However, you cannot completely eliminate, at least this is my understanding of the legal rulings, you cannot completely eliminate power production altogether, because then you would be completely eliminating an authorized use. So the Corps has discretion to prioritize fish and reduce power production, as long as it's not reducing it to the point where it doesn't exist at all. And that's what we're going to be arguing, like for these deep drawdowns, is, yeah, maybe it impairs power production for several months, but you can still produce power at other times. And so it's not completely eliminating it. And therefore the ESA trumps, and you have to prioritize the fish during those few months.
Great, thanks, Laurie. Meta asks, who was supposed to be overseeing the Corps after the 2008 study? And she says she missed the beginning of the presentation, so you may have covered this, but you may want to revisit.
Lizzy, I'll let you handle that because you were doing the early facts.
Oh, well, under the ESA, NIMS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, is primarily responsible for enforcing the ESA. And so that's actually why NIMS is a defendant in our lawsuit, because NIMS had an obligation along with the Corps to reinitiate consultation as soon as it became clear that the impacts of the action were going to be greater than NIMS anticipated in that 2008 BIOP, which according to us and the court occurred in about 2013 when the Corps decided that it wasn't going to meet those big permanent passage deadlines that it was supposed to.
Thanks, Lizzy. One last question here from Doug. This is an interesting one here. Is the Corps fine with foregoing power production as long as Congress eliminates it as a project purpose, or do they have some independent attachment to power production?
I don't think they have a personal attachment to power production, but the big issue is money, money, money. As long as there's power production, BPA is on the hook for paying for a lot of what needs to happen. It is pretty incredible how much the agencies are spending on research and monitoring and all of these studies. The Corps studies before it does anything. And so some of those permanent passage facilities that Laurie mentioned were required under the 2008 BIOP. You know, they have price tags of a few $100 million. And I think that's a little optimistic for some of those. And so I think that's the big question is if you eliminate power production, then the Corps is going to have to get appropriations every year for the costs of a lot of this fish mitigation, which is more complicated.
And I mean, the fact is too, I mean, the Corps is just, it's the Corps, you know, they don't like to change. They like the status quo. They've been using, you know, they have these rule curl with what they call rule curves, which is how they operate the water flows in the reservoirs, the level of the reservoir, you know, it's low in the winter and then they gradually increase it, it's high and they gradually, and they've been following these stupid same rule curves since like 1950. And they just, you know, that's what they are. They're a bunch of engineers who have engineered things and they don't want to change. And so part of it is just BPA pressure, and part of it is the Corps not wanting to change its operations, certainly not to help fish. But if Congress deauthorized power, then they won't really have a choice.
Yeah. Well, thank you both again for a really fantastic presentation. We have a request for the slides from this presentation, so I'm happy to provide, just so you all know, if anybody is interested in the slides from this presentation, email me directly. I'm happy to send it to you. I will also be posting this webinar on our new YouTube channel, which I will send information out about. And lastly, before I let you all go, I want to give a really warm, heartfelt thank you to some special donors of ours in Oregon, Todd Wells and Nancy Burgeon, who have been longtime supporters of us and our work, especially our Oregon office. They are like really big champions of our Oregon work, wonderful folks. They really want to drum up support for our Oregon office and the incredible work that Laurie, Lizzy, and Andrew, who's obviously not on the call, do over in Portland. So they are offering a 1-to-1 dollar-for-dollar match for any donation that is made as a result of this webinar. So that is really wonderful of them. Any donation that you decide to make this evening or you know, in the next few days as a result of having been on this webinar and been inspired by the work that Laurie and Lizzy are doing, they will match your donation dollar for dollar. Really generous of them. So you know, and we can't do this work without you, without your support. So that's it really warms my heart to know that there are people out there who are so dedicated to this conservation work and to what we do. And when you donate, we will send you a copy of our latest newsletter, which has all the latest information about the work that Laurie and Lizzy are doing and the rest of our wonderful attorneys here in the Boise office, and some great artwork by artist Rachel Tenellock, who created all these paintings just for Advocates for the West work on saving salmon and steelhead. It's her Confluence project. You'll be able to read more about that in here and see more of her paintings. You've got really lovely folks out there who are collaborating with us to help protect salmon and steelhead, and it's just lovely to know that these people are out there who care so much. So that is all I have for you. I hope that you enjoyed this webinar. Thank you again very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all next month. Thanks again, Laurie and Lizzy, and have a great night, everybody.
Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Night.
Right.